Good morning, everyone. I'm Marge Stockton, and I'll be your online worship leader for this morning's service. This is Common Ground. During the service, we recommend you have your Zoom screen set to speaker view. This is Common Ground, our celebration of worship for people of many paths who are gathering virtually to share in the responsible search for meaning and truth. Pathways is a warm and open community where all who come with open minds and kind hearts are welcome, regardless of ability, age, race, gender identity, or sexual orientation. If you're visiting with us today, we welcome you to our virtual service and hope you'll visit us in person when we can be together again. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, to send us a note about yourself, a note about your visit, or ask for more information about Pathways. Email office@pathwaysuu.org. We hope that all who joined us here today find this a safe place to worship. We have a special request announcement this morning. Please help the Pathways Ad Hoc Committee on Racism by taking the 5-minute survey you should have received by separate mail. The Ad Hoc Committee is planning to initiate new small groups we have titled Race Matters to study and discuss important and current topics of race. To get started, all recipients of the newsletter should have received a short multiple choice survey to fill out to determine the level of interest and concern within the Pathways congregation. We will provide more information on this following receipt of the survey. Thank you for participating. For our gathering song this morning, we honor the late Congressman and civil rights hero, John Lewis, with a musical interpretation of his famous motto, "Make good trouble."
Stand up and make good trouble. Speak up and make good trouble. Get up and make good trouble. Rise up and make good trouble. Stand up and make good trouble. Speak up and make good trouble. Get up and make good trouble. Rise up and make good trouble. Stand up and make good trouble. Speak up and make good trouble. Get up and make good trouble. Rise up and make good trouble. Never be afraid to make some noise. Make some noise. Never be afraid to make some noise. Make some noise.
This is the struggle of a lifetime. Makes good trouble. This is the struggle of a lifetime. And make good trouble. This is the struggle of a lifetime. And make good trouble. This is the struggle of a lifetime. And make good trouble.
So you tell us to wait. You tell us to be patient. We cannot wait. We cannot be patient. We want our freedom and we want it now.
As we virtually light our chalice this morning, please join me in these words by Reverend Don Shea Cooley. We light our chalice this morning grateful for the love that we experience in this beloved community. May the flame light the way for all who seek such abundance. I invite you to join me in a renewal of our sacred promises. Please read along with me. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other. Our call to worship today is by Kimberly Ann Tomczyk Carlson. It is not by chance that you arrived here today. You have been looking for something larger than yourself. Inside of you, there is a yearning, a calling, a hope for more, a desire for a place of belonging and caring. Through your struggles, someone nurtured you into being, instilling a belief in a shared purpose, a common yet precious resource that belongs to all of us when we share. And so you began seeking a beloved community, a people that does not put fences around love, a community that holds its arms open to possibilities of love, a heart home to nourish your soul and share your gifts. Welcome home. Welcome to worship. For our worship song today, we are delighted to present the Pathways Come As You Are choir with hymn 1051, We Are.
For each of us born, the morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each of us born, the morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandmother's dreams. We are the bread of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of good and fathers of God. We are daughters of dust and sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy and brothers of love. We are lovers of life and builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We are makers of peace and the wisdom of grace. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandmother's dreams. We are the bread of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. Each of us born, the morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each of us born, the morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are one.
Our speaker for this morning's service is Taylor Stewart. Taylor graduated from the University of Portland in 2018. He is currently in the final year of a Master's of Social Work program at Portland State University. He started the Oregon Remembrance Project program in the fall of 2018 to memorialize the history of lynching and to memorialize Oregon's only documented African American victim of lynching, Alonzo Tucker. Taylor's work addresses the contemporary truth telling and repair work needed to reconcile our relationship with history. And now we welcome Taylor Stewart to our virtual pulpit.
Good morning, all. I'm
morning.
Taylor Stewart. I'm honored to be speaking with you today, as this is the first time I've ever spoken outside of Oregon. When I started my journey 2.5 years ago, never in a million years would I have thought folks from out of state would want to hear my story. The story starts the summer after I graduated college in 2018. I went on this trip called the Civil Rights Immersion, where we went to various locations of historical significance. We traveled to Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. I was especially looking forward to the portion of the trip where we'd be going to Montgomery, because we had plans to see the new Equal Justice Initiative museums. I was a big fan of Brian Stevenson, the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, and I'd heard about these museums in one of my classes. In April 2018, the Equal Justice Initiative opened up 2 museums. The first was the Legacy Museum, which chronicles the link between slavery and mass incarceration, with the belief that slavery didn't end in 1865, it just evolved. The second is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, or the Lynching Memorial. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented nearly 6,500 lynchings of African Americans between the years of 1865 to 1950. When you enter the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, you are confronted with these 6-foot-high pillars that have the name of the state, the name of the county, and then the names of everyone who was lynched in that county. There are over 800 pillars representing the over 800 counties where lynchings took place. I had always known about lynching in the abstract, but to actually read the names of people who were lynched in this country made this history personal. I had no idea the magnitude of it all. Name after name after name. What got me most was seeing names with the last name Stewart, knowing that simply time and place separated me from the name on the pillar. As you make your way through the museum, the pillars, which are originally perpendicular to the floor, begin to come off the ground until finally they are hanging above you, symbolizing many of the victims of lynching. As you continue, you begin to learn more about what was the culture of lynching in America. You learn that minor social transgressions could get you lynched. You learn that asking for a fair price in trade could get you lynched. You learn that sometimes when the white mob couldn't find who they were looking for, they would simply lynch an innocent bystander in their place. You learn that when you were Black, any act or any behavior could result in your lynching. When you stand in the center of the museum and look around you, you are surrounded by the 800 pillars, which represented the crowd which was so frequently present at these events. At this spot in the center, our tour guide told us a story about her hometown. This was a small town in Alabama. In this small town, businesses close early on Wednesdays. Not your big stores like Walmart or Walgreens, but your local stores, your mom and pop stores, they close early on Wednesdays because that's just tradition. Well, that tradition started so that everyone could make it to the lynchings on time because lynchings were held on Wednesdays. And despite the history of that tradition, businesses still close early on Wednesdays in this small Alabama town. I was awestruck. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice was the most heartbreaking part of our trip. I couldn't believe that no one had ever told me about lynching in America before. I couldn't believe that I had gotten 22 years in this country knowing nothing about this history, and I couldn't believe that no one was talking about this. Why do we not talk about lynching in America? We talk about 9/11 as America's first encounter with terrorism, but that's simply not true. There had long been an era of domestic terrorism in the United States. Nearly 6,500 lynchings. That's more than just nearly 6,500 individuals. That's nearly 6,500 times the entire African American community sustained an act of domestic terrorism, all in less than 100 years. Consider the fear, the constant daily fear that African Americans lived under, knowing that at any moment, at any time, they too could be hanging from the trees. This should really alter our perception of what life in America was like at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Lynching left thousands of African Americans dead, imposed racial subordination, forced the exodus of millions from the South, and marginalized African Americans in this country's social, political, and economic life in ways that can still be felt today. Visiting the National Memorial for Peace and Justice was a profound encounter with history for me, an encounter that I wanted to bring home and share. Luckily, in conjunction with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the Equal Justice Initiative has also started the Community Remembrance Project. The Community Remembrance Project aims to work in the communities where lynchings took place to find healing and reconciliation through a sober reflection on history. I knew there was at least one lynching of an African American in Oregon. His name was Alonzo Tucker, and he was lynched in Coos Bay, Oregon in 1902. There is an interest forum online about getting involved with the Community Remembrance Project. Now, I would love to say that when I saw that, I immediately was like, sign me up. How can I help? But that wouldn't be true. In fact, I was too nervous to fill out the interest form. After all, this was the Equal Justice Initiative, and I was a recent college grad with no relevant experience. I figured, who am I to think that I could really make a difference? So I decided I wasn't going to fill out the interest form, but thankfully, 2 encounters from the rest of my trip inspired me to change my mind. The first was a quote from John Lewis, longtime civil rights icon and congressman from Georgia, who asked, "If not us, then who? If not now, then when?" This taught me the urgency of now. The second was the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Even though I was deeply moved by the 2 Equal Justice Initiative museums, my favorite museum from our trip was the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Here, they just focused on Mississippi history. So there was no mention of individuals like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, these individuals who we kind of deify. Instead, the museum told the story of everyday Mississippians who did their part to pave the way for justice. So, what I learned at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum is that you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. And so, these 2 encounters gave me the courage to reach out to the Equal Justice Initiative, and 2.5 years later, here we are. I'll talk a little bit more about what we've been doing in Coos Bay a little bit later. As for now, I am here to tell you what I wish was told to me, so that when you go to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice one day, you won't have to say, "How come no one ever told me about lynching before?" I am here to tell you about the legacy of lynching, how we can find reconciliation, and how lynching is still a relevant topic to us today. Because despite what we may like to think, lynching was not the work of a few hooded vigilantes. whole communities participated in the ritualistic killing of African Americans. The legacy of lynching was not hidden away in the shadows of the night. The legacy of lynching was broadcast in broad daylight on the courthouse lawn. The era of lynching may be behind us, but we as a nation won't ever be able to move past it until we confront this legacy. Lynching was domestic terrorism. And in this era of domestic terrorism, African Americans had to live under the constant fear that their actions could result in a lynching. White individuals accused of identical violation of law or custom were rarely subjected to the same fate. Lynching increasingly and exclusively became a racialized tool of control over the African American population. This history should make us all feel uncomfortable. The barbarity, impunity, and spectacle of lynching are difficult to grapple with. What's most horrifying is the celebration of lynching, the way it was exalted in the white community. When you see pictures of lynchings, it's not the Black bodies that are most disturbing. It's the sea of white faces looking on that are most ominous. The way they smile, the way they lean into frame, I know no greater depths of the depravity of humanity than lynching in America. Black suffering became white entertainment. So, what precipitated lynching? Well, a variety of things. One of the most common was the accusation of sexual assault, which was largely driven by the pervasive fear of interracial sex. During this time period, the mere accusation of rape was enough to incite a mob. And any action that could remotely be interpreted as a Black man seeking sexual contact with a white woman was subject to this pervasive fear. Something as innocuous as a Black man accidentally bumping into a white woman could result in the accusation of sexual assault. This would be because the myth of the Black male rapist permeated society, as it was a widely held belief that a white woman couldn't willingly consent to sex with a Black man. When famed anti-lynching advocate Ida B. Wells challenged this myth about lynching and asserted that when in fact there was a charge of rape, in many instances it was really a consensual relationship, a mob burned down her newspaper and threatened to lynch her. More than half of the Equal Justice Initiative documented lynching victims during the Jim Crow era were killed under some accusation of committing murder or rape. This would be because the deep racial hostility of the time inspired increased suspicion on the Black community whenever a crime was discovered, whether or not any evidence tied the accused to the crime. However, it wasn't just accusations of a crime that resulted in lynching. Violating the rules of the social order also had fatal consequences. There was a saying at the time that what the law cannot do, the noose can. African Americans were lynched for things like speaking disrespectfully to a white person, refusing to step off the sidewalk, reprimanding white children, arguing with a white man, and other minor social grievances. African Americans had to live with the knowledge that they could be lynched whether they intentionally or unintentionally violated social norms. I personally cannot imagine what it was like to be Black during this time and to have to go into the white part of town knowing the slightest misstep could get you killed at any moment. But even more than that, I can't imagine going into the white community with the knowledge that that community was capable of a public spectacle lynching. What I tell people is to remember what it was like the very first time you saw the video of George Floyd, to remember how sick it made you feel to watch someone plead for their life as that life was being taken away from them. But then to imagine that rather than feel sick, you found that video pleasurable. Not only that, imagine you found it so pleasurable that you would get together with your friends so that you could all enjoy the video together. Imagine getting a whole crowd of people together on that Minneapolis street so that you could all be there live for the killing of George Floyd, because that's what public spectacle lynchings were like. Public spectacle lynchings were those in which large numbers of people, sometimes in the thousands, gathered to witness the pre-planned killing of an African American in a manner that included prolonged torture, dismemberment, and/or burning of the victim. These were carnival-like events that included food vendors, photographs, and the selling of body parts. It was especially popular at that time to take a picture of the lynching that could then be turned into a postcard and distributed to friends, family, or merely kept as a souvenir. Either while the lynching victim was still alive or after they were dead, body parts were also distributed. And those body parts were kept as cherished family heirlooms and passed from one generation to the next. Public spectacle lynchings were brazen, celebratory acts by the entire white community that sent a clear message that Blacks were less than human. This would be because lynching was always meant to send a message. Lynching was about much more than simply killing someone. Sometimes white mobs forced other Black people to witness lynchings and told them that if they didn't leave town, they too would meet a similar fate. In order to maximize the terrorizing symbol of the noose, some mobs conducted their lynchings within the Black part of town, or many other times, the mob would drag the body of a lynching victim behind a car throughout the Black community to send a message. However, sometimes Black people were lynched simply for resisting mistreatment. The targets of these lynchings were frequently sharecroppers, ministers, and community leaders who resisted being mistreated or espoused Black advancement beyond the confines of the Jim Crow era. Lynching became a tool to keep African Americans in a state of subjugation and repress African Americans' fight for economic power and equal rights during the 19th and 20th centuries. It is difficult to fathom what life must have been like for African Americans living during this time. We cannot say enough about the psychological wounds inflicted on the African American community, nor can we understate the psychological damage the white community passed on from generation to generation in this socialization of violence. Nor can we ignore our state institutions' indifference, complicity, and endorsement of lynching. And so, as we talk about lynching here today, I am here to tell you that we are not as far removed from lynching culture as we would like to think. Because if we really want to see how lynching has survived, we need not look further than the American death penalty. Our death penalty is the most direct legacy of lynching. At the same time, lynchings in the United States were going down, executions were going up. Lynching began to taper off during the 1930s in large part due to the NAACP's campaign that decried lynching as America's national shame. Hence, your everyday Southerner began to see the barbarity of these outdoor events. And so, lynching simply moved indoors, where all white juries and expedited trials carried out the same verdict as the lynch mob. During the 1930s, 2/3 of all executions in the United States were of African Americans. Between the years of 1910 to 1950, despite making up 22% of the South's population, African Americans accounted for 75% of all of those executed in the region, And this disproportionality continues to today, where African Americans make up 13% of the population, but 41% of those who are on death row. And when you consider the fact that of that 41%, nearly all are African American males, yet African American males only make up 6.5% of our population, we have to ask ourselves, how do we get from 6.5 to 41%? The color of your skin still plays a crucial role in whether our society believes you deserve death or not. When we look at someone and are comfortable saying, you deserve to die, that decision is tainted by racial bias. There was a study out of the University of Washington in 2014 that looked at jurors in Washington state and found that jurors were 3 times more likely to recommend a death sentence for a Black defendant than for a white defendant accused of similar crime. Nearly every sophisticated study that has looked at the issue of race of victim in capital punishment sentencing has found that you are more likely to get the death sentence if the victim is white. This is especially true if the defendant is Black. We still treat the accusation of Black on white crime differently. Of the 170 individuals who have been exonerated from death row since the reinstatement of the death penalty, meaning individuals who are wrongfully arrested, wrongfully convicted, wrongfully put in prison, wrongfully put on death row, over half have been African American. We are still trying to kill innocent Black people. The states in the South, plus Texas and Oklahoma, had the highest number of lynchings. And since the death penalty's reinstatement, those states alone have accounted for 87% of all executions in the United States. The same region of the country that lynched is the same region of the country that executes. People always ask, how did the North tolerate slavery? How did the North tolerate lynching? How did the North tolerate segregation? The answer? The same way we tolerate the South right now. We are too busy asking ourselves the question, does this person deserve to die for their crime, that we haven't asked ourselves the question, do we deserve to kill? Did you know Germany doesn't have the death penalty? Germany knows that given their history, it would be unconscionable for the country of Germany to systematically execute its citizens, especially if a disproportionate number of those citizens were Jewish. The world would be in outrage. We in the United States would be outraged if that were the case. So where is that same outrage when, given our history, the United States systematically executes its citizens and a disproportionate number of those citizens are African American? Where is the outrage when, given the history of the state, a disproportionate number of African Americans sit on Texas's death row? Where is the outrage? Because I don't hear it. If Black Lives Matter, prove it. Because the legacy of lynching and the power of the noose are still alive today. They just look a little bit different. The moral outrage of future generations is hypocritical. We condemn the institution of lynching while failing to condemn its legacy. Everyone wants to say that if they had been around during the lynching era, they wouldn't have stood by. They would have said something. They would have done something. Well, I can tell you, lynching is still going on and you're still standing by, still not saying anything, still not doing anything. We are burdened by our history of injustice, but more importantly, we are burdened by our history of silence and inaction. But I am here to tell you that it doesn't have to be this way. We have the power to recreate our relationship with history and rewrite the ending to history's stories. That's what we're trying to do in Coos Bay, Oregon. Our collective memory and our collective consciousness hold power. What we choose to remember, as well as how we choose to remember history, is a reflection of the soul of our society. We are trying to insert the story of Alonzo Tucker, Oregon's only documented African-American victim of lynching, into the collective memory and collective consciousness of Oregon. What we need is reconciliation with history. But how do you reconcile a lynching? That is the question I have been wrestling with for the last 2.5 years. Brian Stevenson, Executive Director of the Equal Justice Initiative, says truth and reconciliation are sequential. So in order to get to reconciliation, we must first engage in the requisite truth-telling. And we have started this truth-telling work in Coos Bay. On February 29th, 2020, we held a soil collection ceremony for Alonzo Tucker near the spot where he was killed. We collected 2 jars of soil, one that was sent back to the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, and the other that is now on display at the Coos History Museum. Hidden in this soil was the story of Alonzo Tucker. We began this truth-telling work with the soil ceremony, and we will continue this work by permanently installing this history into the geographic memory of Oregon. In June 2021, we will be installing an Equal Justice Initiative historical marker in Coos Bay. The historical marker will be 2-sided. One side will tell the story of lynching in America as a whole, and the other side will tell the story of Alonzo Tucker. This visible acknowledgement will serve to memorialize Alonzo Tucker in the collective memory and collective consciousness of Coos Bay. We hope that by giving voice to this story in such a permanent way, we can get closer to reconciling our relationship with history. However, we find reconciliation for this lynching not by our acts of remembrance, but by how those acts of remembrance change us. We find reconciliation not by our knowledge of lynching, but by what we do with that knowledge. We find reconciliation not by reflecting solely on the past, but by critically evaluating the present. Because truth and reconciliation may be sequential, but that's not all there is. There's something in between. There is repair, and it's repair that brings us from truth to reconciliation. Public remembrance only goes so far. We must take action in the present day to repair the harms of the past. Only through a critical examination of history can the past illuminate the present and guide us towards the future. I don't believe we can truly find reconciliation for lynching until we end the heir to its legacy, the death penalty. I believe ending the death penalty is the repair work in between truth and reconciliation. 2.5 years ago, I set out to reconcile the lynching of Alonzo Tucker, and that is still my goal. I've just learned along the way that it's going to take more than a few acts of remembrance, because I don't believe we can reconcile this lynching while a disproportionate number of African Americans sit on Oregon's death row. As a lynching state, I believe we have an imperative from history that compels us to right this wrong. I accept the things that I cannot change, and I change the things that I cannot accept. And I cannot accept race being the largest predictive factor in capital punishment sentencing. I cannot accept the continuation of lynching, and I cannot accept that no one is talking about this. So, I am building a coalition to end the death penalty in Oregon, and I want to challenge you to do the same. You have an enormous task ahead of you being in Texas, but don't let the size of the mountains stop you from taking that first step. I believe Pathways Church can reach the larger community on what it means to recreate our relationship with history. It is time to no longer stand by. It's time to say something. It's time to do something. You are now responsible for the knowledge of lynching and the death penalty, and what you do with that knowledge is up to you, because you can no longer say, "No one ever told me." You may not think you can make a meaningful difference, but I believe you can. One conversation at a time, one friend at a time, one community at a time. I believe you can be part of a grassroots movement to repair the harms of the past and end the death penalty across the United States. It just takes the political will. It's time to get into some good trouble. From my trip to the South, I learned that it's okay to believe in something even when you've never seen it before. And it's okay to see something even when others don't believe in it. So I'm asking you to believe in your own change-making ability, to believe in repair, and to believe that we can find reconciliation with history. You may not think you're qualified to have these conversations, but I believe you are. If I've learned anything, it's that it's less about being the right person for the moment as it is about doing the right thing for the moment. Even Martin Luther King Jr. didn't think he was the right person for the moment, but he acted anyway because he knew it was the right thing to do. On December 5th, 1955, a little-known pastor accepted the nomination to become president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, gave his first large public address, and the rest is history. Stepping into that moment is what made him the right person. So I'm asking you to step with me into this moment. When I was younger, I used to think that it was remarkable people that did remarkable things. However, as I've gotten older, I've realized that it's remarkable things that make remarkable people, and I believe that you can be a part of something that's remarkable. Don't underestimate your ability to be the change you want to see in this world, because let me tell you, you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. We've all known about lynching, as you say, in the abstract, but you've made it real and you've presented us with a big challenge going forward. As we extinguish our virtual chalice today, please join me in these words. Knowing how quickly the flame of truth may be extinguished, how easily the chalice of fellowship broken, let us be vigilant in faith, keep peace in our hearts, and make care for one another the watchword of our lives together. So our light goes out everywhere into the world. Our closing song today is another motto that challenges us not to lose sight of our goals for ourselves, our church, our community, our country. Keep on moving forward by Emma's Revolution.
And to keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning Gonna keep on moving proudly. Keep on moving proudly. Keep on moving proudly. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna keep on singing loudly. Keep on singing loudly. Keep on singing loudly. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna reach across our borders. Reach across our borders. Reach across our borders. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna end the occupations. End the occupations. End the occupations. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna stop this war together. Stop this war together. Stop this war together. Never turning back. Never turning back. Gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. 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 Never turning back.
We hope that each of you on your individual path through the joys and questions of life found some common ground with your fellow travelers here today. In our closing words today, we again honor the late Congressman John Lewis. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something. Democracy is not a state, it is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Make good trouble. Our thanks again to Taylor Stewart and all of you who joined our Zoom service today. Now we invite you to unmute your microphones, turn on your video, and stick around for a few minutes to visit. Taylor will be with us. Taylor will be with us for a while, so I invite you to meet him and talk about his presentation. The adult groups will start at 11:30.
It's wonderful.
Thank you so much, Taylor. I feel so proud